Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depends on where you are. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. This is the Iraq Initiative's event on a discussion of the Iraqi government's white paper for economic reform. I am Al-Kadhimi, Director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council. I'm joined by a distinguished panel of friends and experts. I will introduce them in a second. But before that, I would like to mention that this is an event that is on the record. You are welcome to tweet from it. You could use AC Iraq, or you could use Atlantic Council hashtags. This is also an event that will be for an hour time, and we will benefit from the presence of experts in various fields that are pertinent to the white papers sections. Before we start, I would like to thank the team at the Atlantic Council, the assistant director, associate director actually, of the Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative, Masoud Mustajabi, Zainab Vironin is the on the communications team, and Jackson Styron as well. And special thanks to this team for working on an off day. Today, the Atlantic Council is closed, but they stayed with us to bring this event. So we are very grateful to them. The panel is composed of Harry Estepanian. He is Senior Fellow at the Iraq Energy Institute, and Alia Mubayid, Managing Director, Fixed Income Strategy at Jefferies International, and Ahmed Tabakhchali, Chief Information Officer at the Asia Frontier Capital. Ahmed also happens to be part of the team that prepared the white paper, so we will benefit from that aspect of his role. And we can start right away skipping biographies. They are all in need of no introduction. And let me start with Ahmed, and to ask you, Ahmed, tell us about the white paper. What is the philosophy? What are the goals of this paper? And tell us a little bit about the timing also of the paper. As you well know, and our audience knows, it is always the preferred to plan for economic reform, have your time. But this is a paper that came out in a time where Iraq was in the middle of the crisis. So it is more of a crisis management paper rather than it is a sort of a planning for meeting a crisis or anticipating a crisis. Of course, this is not a criticism of the Iraqi government, even though we do criticize governments when it's due. But in this case, in fairness, both Prime Minister Mustafa Al-Kadhimi and the main author of the paper, Dr. Ali Alawi, came to the government right in the middle of the crisis. So they were both out of the political process for many years. In the case of Mustafa Al-Kadhimi, he was not in any executive role, and Dr. Alawi is out of government for many years now. So this is, the crisis that they are dealing with is not of their own doing, but we are talking about Iraq in general and how the paper came into being and what it means for the country from that timing. So tell us a little bit about the paper, its philosophy, its goals, and also the timing, please.
Thank you, Abbas, and thank you, Atlantic Council. I'm privileged to be with you today, and
Ahmed, I think, yeah, okay, we hear you.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, apologies.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, so
you're joining us from Baghdad, so the internet is.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges that we have is like an infrastructure. That's one of the issues of the paper. Now, basically, I think you're quite right in the sense that the timing is not perfect for planning economic reform. However, this is not an Iraq problem. It's a problem that's it always rears its ugly head just at the wrong time. We never seem to be able to do the things when the time is right. We always do them when the time is wrong. That's always been the case, and that's what makes this particular paper that much, at the timing of it makes it very, very challenging. However, got to keep in mind as well, which you mentioned, it's like this government came in precisely because there were issues with the economy in general. That's why we had the protest movement. I certainly believe that there's always been an economic underlying for all, sort of all societal movements. So basically, the issue with what's wrong with Iraq and what the paper argues is it differs. Actually, I have to say this, and quite importantly, it differs from all prior Iraqi papers in one very important aspect, and that's actually it does not look at the symptoms. All our prior efforts at dealing with various crises, we had them in 2014, 2016, we had them before, they've always looked at the symptoms. This paper, in a sense, under the leadership of Minister Alawi, looks at the issues from the heart of it, i.e. at the core, what is wrong with our economy, and it tries to, it attempts to resolve that. So basically, it takes its point of view that what ails the Iraqi economy. Yes, this crisis here is fairly serious. Yes, it's unanticipated. And yes, we could not have predicted it. However, the structural fault lines of the Iraqi economy would have inevitably led to a crisis like this. It was only a question of time, not of if. It was always going to happen, irrespective of the crash in oil prices. And so basically it looks at the real issue and says where it went wrong is the state. And we can argue over what exactly time took place, but oil revenue started flowing in a big way in the 70s, and that's when the state used those to increase, one, its role in society and in the economy. It did so over in three ways. The first one, it went in and expanded the public sector through public sector hiring, but also it enlarged the role of the private sector. So the private sector, directly or indirectly, controls all aspects of the economy. And finally, it provided a matrimonial role whereby it provides almost every kind of service you can think of for free. Now, these were the underlying factors, and these were the factors that were sort of fermenting over time. Post 2003, we had an opportunity to revisit and rethink. However, what seems to have taken place is exactly the same as before, but it accelerated in the sense that the various power centers went on over the same process and accelerated so much. We got to the stage whereby currently it is completely unsustainable. Where we are right now in terms of, let's say, the crisis as seen, because given the specific role of the state, the budget has become like almost the tool that the state uses it to expand its role. We got to a stage whereby we are far worse than we were in any prior crises. Currently, if you look at all our revenues, and forget the weak prices of the last few days, if you just think of it, you take a view on saying if oil prices, let's say, average 40 this year and average something like 55 next year or 50, I mean, I know they're pretty lofty, and you look at there, and oil revenues don't even cover salaries. So salaries and things will probably be 120% of oil revenues, let alone other aspects of the thing. So how does the paper approach that? First of all, it tries to get a buy-in. There's a huge element of a buy-in in the process, and that's why you see the paper divided in two halves. The first half is a description of the problem, analysis of the problem. It meant to engage Iraqis, because ultimately it takes two in a way to fix this, is the public as well as the state or the political class. So it explains the issues as it sees it, and based on that explanation, it goes and tackles the issues. But before it begins to tackle the issues and lays a philosophy of the solution, it has to deal, as you said, with the current budget crisis. the budget crisis, as I said, the basic issue is Iraq is not, by the way, a country that's going to go bankrupt. It's not a country in a crisis that way. But the crisis basically is our revenues, and we do have revenues, and they're going to be fairly decent, but they're nowhere near our expenses. Our expenses have gone way too far. So the first part of the paper is actually, it will deal with stopping the hemorrhaging of the budget. And that will be done, I think most probably will be seen through the 2021 budget, in the sense that the first applications of rationalizing expenditures versus revenues, that will take place in that. Once that is begun to be approached, because we need to stop that before we can do really anything with the economy. So if you stop the bleeding and just put it on a right path, it looks at removing the role of the state. And gradually, it acknowledges, by the way, that one of the corollaries of the enlarged role of the state has been the absence of a private sector. Almost every solution that you see right now in Iraq and says increasing the role of the private sector, and even in the past, the problem with that is that you have to acknowledge that the private sector is pretty insignificant in Iraq, that enlarging it, encouraging it to grow, will take an enormous effort and also time. What it does, it attempts to remove the structural impediments to the private sector growth. So basically, it looks at, for instance, at regulations, how to enable the private sector to work. It looks at the banking sector, reforming the banking sector, or maybe actually not even reforming it, but putting it on the right path, because without a banking sector as a means of exchange, as well as a provider of capital, you're not going to have a private sector. Then it looks at the other things that stop the private sector, for example, the role of the state-owned enterprises. It looks at gradually reducing these roles. And eventually, once you begin to have the enablers of the economy, it says, look, it recognizes the state will have a role to play for a long number of years. And so basically, the state has to put its own house in order, and that goes through what is called a public management system, public financial management system, which we don't have. Our systems are pretty much run on. Essentially, they haven't changed, by the way, from the 70s and 80s, pen and paper based. We use technology, but at the most basic levels. So it looks at upgrading its capabilities in order to deal with its current resources, in order to provide those services. So that's, in a way, the genesis of it. And there's also a lot of other aspects. Once you take that in place, you look at the other enabling sector of the economy. So you look at agriculture, and you look at all the other sectors that are involved in the economy, but it actually tries to prioritize them. One other aspect it looks at, and it's going to be fairly important, I think, somewhere where Harry will be talking about, it looks at the matrimonial role of the state and trying to reduce that.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. This is particularly helpful, especially that many in our audience, of course, the paper was released in its Arabic version, the official version. There was an English version prepared, but the official English version is still in the making. So I'm very grateful for you to go over the main components of the paper, and what it means, and what are the issues that it concentrates on. And if I were to go to Alia, and to our benefit, all our panelists are Arabic speakers, so they all read the white paper in its original language, and we are very grateful to have them spare the time and help us unpack what its components consist of. Alia, you've heard Ahmed, you read the paper. This white paper came in a time when, as I said, Iraq is in a triple crisis. Of course, there is the political unrest from the protests that started a year ago in October 2019. There was also the COVID crisis that is an international crisis, not just on Iraq, but it really went down heavy on Iraq for the particular situation the country is in, and also the decline in oil prices that came right in the heels of COVID, or maybe the other way around, depends on whom you ask and which country we talk about. But that also moved the oil from the semi-comfortable prices that Iraq was dealing with. And we must remember that 93% of Iraqi budget comes from oil revenues. So when oil came down to $18, or even in certain times, long-term trades were in the minus, the country was without cash. And now with the current prices, Iraq is somewhere in the Ahmed can correct me on that or not, in the probably $2 billion a month in deficit for their must-receive revenues. How is Iraq financial foundation looking to you? And when you read the paper, how do you see the paper addressing some of the chronic problems and also the problems that came from the crisis? What is your overall evaluation of the situation and the potential for the white paper to do anything or make a dent in this?
Sure. Thank you very much, Abbas, for involving me in this interesting discussion with friends. And indeed, where I sit in financial markets, Iraq has been for a long time one of those countries, particularly in the MENA region, where financial markets had a lot of difficulty identifying or assigning a proper level or an accurate level of risk premia, because of the absence of policy frameworks and clear paths towards addressing the multiple challenges, particularly macroeconomic challenges that Iraq has been facing given the multiple shocks that it has been receiving. And this is unlike what we are seeing around us in the region, particularly in other oil exporting countries, where many of those countries have clear policy frameworks, budget documents, etc. So in a way, this policy papers comes at a time where markets were looking for a way forward, for a clear, basically policy choices that the white paper addresses. And even though maybe we may not have seen this translate into lower risk premia, because over the last year, a measure of risk in financial markets in Iraq, which is the widening of spreads on its bonds in the market, have signified an increasing level of risk. We have not yet seen a reduction in this risk premia, because, as you mentioned, people need to assimilate and better understand how these policies are going to be put through. So the point here is that it is a very good timing and a badly needed piece of the puzzle that Iraq needs to lower its risk premia. The second point is really of my evaluation is about the elements that it presents to both to the Iraqi citizens and to the financial markets at large. It is, as Ahmed said, it provides for the first time a candid assessment of the problems of Iraq, and this is not very common in our part of the world, where we're calling a spade, talking about the unsustainable wage bill, the loss-making enterprises, the unsustainable path of public finances, and all in an evidence-based policy, evidence-based diagnostic, based on numbers, so that you can guide even those who don't understand and permit a policy dialogue in society, even before things get worse. And that is important. Where, for example, in other countries that are facing crisis in the region, this has not been the case. The crisis has occurred, and then those kind of policy documents have sprung. So this candid assessment is very important. The second positive element is that it sets what is its objective. It tries to quantify them at a certain moment in terms of the size of the state, reducing the wage bill. It sets the objective in terms of what it wants to do with the financial sector restructuring, with rendering the environment for private sector more competitive. So the objectives of the policies are clear, and that is an important element that has been lacking. But I think the third element also is that it puts the policy in a medium-term perspective. We have always been used to very short-termist approach to policy formulation in Iraq, but also in the rest of the region. And I think now, with this medium-term approach, particularly highlighting the influence and the demographic dynamics and the implication of the very challenging demographic dynamics that Iraq is going to impose on the public finance path and on the economic path, putting this in this medium-term context of the changing demographics, with 40% of jobs being public sector jobs, and between now and 2030 having 5 million new jobs needed to be created. So that is an important clarification of these medium-term paths for policy. But I think also in terms of medium-term, it takes on board the rapidly changing global and regional environment, and that is important by involving or talking about the challenges of COVID, what it implies in terms of expanding spending on the social sector, on the way of delivering social services, but also on the need as Iraq wants to rethink its diversification strategy, to put it in the context of the new economy post-COVID, i.e. more moving towards digitization, agriculture, etc., etc. So all these, I think, are important elements of the white paper, but I also would like to highlight the fact that it highlights the risks, and that is extremely important, and the risks particularly associated with two key elements in Iraq, and one is the weakness of fiscal institution, for which it provides the necessary reform in terms of strengthening financial management, public investment management, procurement, etc. But really, this has been the key risks for Iraq's public finances, given the very high level of corruption and misuse of public funds. So really highlighting this as a key risk and the necessity to tackle it up front in terms of the reform is a key element. And the second risk is obviously what Ahmed called the political, building a political constituency and the political consensus about the bids, and the difficulty of building that consensus and the risk it entails. So I think all these elements are extremely important. However, what I think is missing, again, and which would be important to reduce the level of risk associated with the macro situation in Iraq, is mainly three things. I think the first one is to try to prioritize the reforms, because when one reads the 97 pages of the white paper, one is overwhelmed. I mean, there's a whole long list of reforms in all sectors, but then it is very hard to know what should be the priority. And I think that is critical to have, because we know that institutions and capacity for policy formulation and implementation in Iraq is weak. The second thing that is needed would be costing some of these reforms. I think it is extremely important, and whether costing how much savings some reforms would entail, particularly when we talk about reducing the wage bill or increasing the health insurance coverage. So putting the numbers to some of these policies is critically important. And that takes me to the third missing element, which is really the aspect of highlighting the policy trade-offs, because Iraq has reached a level of, I don't want to say critical level of FX reserve, but certainly in this oil price environment, the depletion, the rate of depletion of the reserve without bold action on reform means that you have to take tough choices, and not doing or not being able for political reasons to cut some spending or raise some taxes may imply some further, more rapid depletion of FX reserve, and may be a devaluation of the Iraqi dinar, with what that implies in terms of social and political costs. So explaining both to the Iraqis and to the wider public the difficulty of balancing these policy trade-offs, and that there will be winners and losers, and understanding the political economy of these policy choices and where who will be the blockers and who will be the enablers of these reforms is something important in order to get the path to policy implementation smoother. I think it mentions the paper that white paper mentions that the government plans to outline very soon a more detailed implementation timetable and responsibilities. But I do hope that these three things, i.e. prioritization, costing, and highlighting policy trade-offs, be part of this next stage of the white paper process. Thank you.
Thank you, Alia. Very helpful and also thorough evaluation of the situation and how the paper fits in. And there was a question, by the way, many questions, and I don't know what we can get to within the hour, but definitely these questions will be taken to heart. And we are also having, I must mention that a series of articles that we are publishing through the Iraq Initiative on the Atlantic Council's blog about the white paper. So we will incorporate some of that and address it. Let me first, before I go to the questions from the audience, turn to Harry, and who is the person I go to on Iraq's electricity questions. Harry, you wrote a paper that just came out, and of course, I remind you of what our mutual friend, Dr. Al-Kadhimi, former Minister of Electricity, said at the moment he assumed office in 2018. He said electricity is a national security issue. And because without electricity, you cannot have an economy, you cannot have much of what you hope for Iraq. In that sense, that needs to be done in economic reform, in economic development, and so many other aspects. And sure enough, Iraq is struggling with this national security issue or dossier. So you wrote a paper for us that was just published a couple of days ago, that you said that the white paper is missing a key point or key issue. Would you like to tell us about this key issue that is missing, how you think that it should be handled, and also your evaluation of the white paper's overview and solutions and recommendations on the electricity sector that you read, and how would you make your own recommendations to augment those?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Abbas, for the invitation, and thank you for the audience. Well, yesterday's article, if some have read the article, I focused on the distribution sector of the electricity sector in Iraq. And this comes from the fact that the emphasis so far since 2003 was on the generation sector mainly. And this is what the white paper also tried to emphasize on. Yesterday or last week, we've been working on putting some figures on the cost that how much the white paper recommendations will cost the Iraqi government, and we came into a conclusion that the implementation of the four aspects that were mentioned in the paper, which are divided into generation, transmission, revenue collection, and renewable energy. The price tag is coming to around $5 to $5.5 billion a year. And that's not much different from what the Iraqi government is currently spending. If we look to the budget of the electricity sector, the annual budget, the federal budget, which is around 10 billion, 46% goes to the investment, and the rest goes to operational, including payments, salaries, and so on. So in our opinion, the white paper is not addressing very fundamental issues that will cut that expenses from 10 billion, which is roughly equivalent to between 8 to 10% of the federal budget. which is roughly, there's no exact figure for the 2020, but if we look to the 2019 budget, it was around 10% of the federal budget. In our opinion, the biggest bottleneck in the electricity sector, which the white paper should have focused, is the distribution system. And the distribution system is neglected big time since 90s, actually, not even in 2003. And in order to improve it, there should be more focus on creating what we think is the retail business. And the retail business is the part that will bring the revenue that will augment or support the generation and the transmission sectors of the electricity. In our opinion, the electricity sector has to be completely reformed. And unfortunately, the white paper hasn't addressed this clearly. There were some discussion in the first part of the white paper about the assessment of the economic condition of Iraq right now. But when it comes to the 5 X's, X's 3, which talks about the infrastructure, it does not address the form that how the government is going to reform the electricity sector, at least. In our opinion, the major bottleneck that we have currently is the legislation part. It's not the technical part, which has been focused on for the last 15, 17 years. It's not about, employing more people to make or to improve the electricity network. It is about the legislation, and there's a big gap right now in the legislations that we need to be set up first before we go to any reform, economic reform, or any reform to the electricity sector in general. And one of those important ones is reviewing of the electricity law that was issued in 2017. If we look to that law, which, by the way, wasn't mentioned clearly in the white paper, which I thought that it should have been clearly stated, that the corporatization of the government entities, which are right now is there, but not clearly defined, is that those companies needs to be defined clearly, their liabilities, their assets, and so on. And this is not properly implemented right now. And this is one of the things that the government needs to do first before it proceeds with the next steps. In 2018, I think the Minister of Electricity was working with international organizations like the EU and the World Bank on those issues, but those haven't been materialized so far. Those needs to be clearly, come into the implementation phase, and after this is done, then we will need to move to the next steps, which are the commercialization of the electricity sector, and then probably down the track we might have, in 10 or 15 years time, we can talk about privatization and so on. So I think the major issue of the electricity sector in general is the legislation. We don't have proper legislation, whether that will be regarding the commercialization of the government entities, or the involvement of the public sector through public-private partnership. So those laws needs to come in place before the government moves to the next steps as planned in the white paper.
Thank you, Harry. I appreciate that. I think we got from the three panelists a great overview of what the paper is, where it went and where it should go as well, and how it fits as, again, in the current Iraqi situation, which is by the admission of the government, is a dire situation. And again, this is an accumulation of over 17 years of, and of course, maybe to be fair, you could even go back to the accumulation of more than that, 27 years or more, because of the sanctions of the 1990s. And I mean, the country was depleted by so many things. The neglect during the Iraq-Iran war from 80 to 88, then the Kuwait crisis and the sanctions, and then what happened after the 2003. So the country has seen a lot, and the resilience is admirable. But again, we are where we are. Let me ask a question to the panel. I'm getting now turning to the questions of the audience, and there was a question about when will we see the English version of the paper. There is a decent English translation actually that was put out. A little bit shorter by a few pages than the original one because of the difference in language expression, but it's a good one. I read it. But Ahmed would probably tell us when it is, when I get to you, Ahmed. But the question that I have, which, I mean, it's hard to select, all of them are great questions, but this question sticks out as particularly interesting to ask. It says, from an anonymous attendee, I wish they mentioned their name, what would be the top 3 priorities of reform according to the panelists? It's an open question, but also it really gives you a chance to revisit your comments and also what you didn't get in to put us through this in the picture. Alia, let me start with you. And they don't have to be in the financial, anywhere in the on the white paper sections.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about the areas. I think to foster growth and push the private sector agenda, Iraq needs to really embark as quickly as possible in the reform of its financial sector. And I think this is critical, both in order to provide the fiscal space, the financing channel for the private sector, but also develop the financial markets and therefore deepen them and help developing tools for funding the government. So I think the financial sector restructuring is critical, along, of course, with the other business related reforms. The second is for me, because the adjustment needed or proposed by the white paper will be quite significant in terms of fiscal adjustment proposed. I think it is, and it talks about reducing the primary deficit from 20% to 3% in a few years. That's a huge fiscal adjustment. Usually we know that this comes at a large social cost, and I think very important is to have a quick improvement in the social safety net, reforming the social safety net in order to ensure that they are better targeted and more efficient. And the third area of reform is obviously, I mean, is everything related to the governance. I think strengthening anti-corruption, public financial management, procurement systems, anything that helps improve basically the efficiency of spending, but also trust in government institutions will be critical to support a buy-in of reforms that the government would like to undertake. So continuing with this this culture of impunity and lack of accountability will not help in the implementation of more painful to come reforms on the fiscal and economic front.
Wonderful, thank you. Ahmed, from your side, what do you see in addition to what Ali just mentioned that would be, in your opinion, priorities for reform at this point? 3 or even more or less, up to you.
Sorry.
You need to
3 or
unmute.
more. Yeah, 3 or more or less. I think the most crucial thing to keep in mind, by the way, when actually even for anyone, when we look at either prioritizing or dealing with it, you got to keep in mind, by the way, the issue of extremely weak capacity of the Iraqi state. I think every one of us who has worked and looked at Iraq, I mean, if we can do, I mean, the thing is, we have a very, very weak capacity in terms of people's abilities and so forth. We have very poor systems. One of the things when I always talk to young people and I look at is, you always look at the Minister of Finance and you expect him to do quite a few things. Think of it, by the way, think of him as a surgeon about to embark on an operation, but you're giving him kitchen tools, like, you know, knives and forks, go and deal with that. And this is exactly what Iraq has to deal with. So in a sense, it comes down to even setting priorities, comes down to an understanding of this, because on the one hand, you want priorities and you want to move the country from where we are right now, but also you've got to be realistic in terms of what actually can you do. So in a sense, you end up by, you have to recognize that no matter what you're going to do, what will they do? I mean, I'm talking of as a private citizen, but whatever you do, we have to work with things. So we got to keep in mind that these are the tools that we have at our disposal right now as a country and as a state. So I would look, first of all, is we have to put our fiscal house in order. We have to realign our expenditures with our income. However, as Alia pointed out, these objectives, they are, you know, in an ideal world, we could lay out a 6-7 year time horizon. We don't have that. The general environment around us does not allow that. What she mentioned on the critical levels of reserves, we don't have that. So in a sense, what we have to do, we end up whatever the state is going to do is going to end up by being a huge contractory force that will contract the economy in a huge, savage way. What we've got to do is immediately try to balance those with things to take care of the vulnerable members of society, and things to get the economy moving. So, i.e., for example, working on banking sector, enabling the banking sector to work, enabling regulations to make it easier for companies, because we do have a reasonably vibrant informal economy. We need to find ways of opening the doors in there. So I would look at, you know, we got to sort of put our house in order, number one, through realigning our expenditures. 2, look at banking and regulations. And
Okay, Ahmed. So let's go to Harry. Ahmed, sometimes with the internet in Baghdad, but thank you for this valuable response. Harry, your take on the priorities, 3, 4 or less, as I told Ahmed. We are at a situation in Iraq where we settle for any reform. 1 is great, 2 are wonderful, 3 are fabulous.
Yes, in my opinion, actually, the major issue that will face the Iraqi government would be the transformation from oil economy to non-oil economy. That's the biggest challenge, in my opinion. And with that needs to come with what the most or the majority of Iraqis are, been asking or demanding for the last, since the protest, which is creating jobs. But unfortunately, creating jobs cannot be done unless we start thinking about the reform of the economy. and with that, the government needs to find the tools. I mean, Ahmed and Alia, they spoke about so many of those tools that the government needs to start working on those. But again, like I mentioned before, you cannot actually start doing those reform unless you have the laws that will allow the government to start moving freely in a new environment, an environment that will create a business for the private sector and the foreign, the FDIs and so on. The other issue, which I believe is important as well, that needs to go in parallel, is the providing the basic services. I think Iraqis have been complaining for so many years of lack of services, whether that would be housing sector or the basic infrastructure, or all this kind of whether it's health, education, those basic services. One of the areas that can create a good motivation to move the economy forward. I think on the long run, as we have seen, as the oil prices is coming down, the focus should be on other resources rather than oil. Iraq has enormous resources other than oil, whether that's agriculture or industry or so on, and those needs to be brought on surface. It has been neglected for the last since 90s, and those needs to be brought up and try to develop them, whether that is on the public side or the private sector side.
Thank you. Let me get to another question from the audience that I find to be helpful. In fact, I mean, again, all of the questions are great. I wish we have 2-3 hours for this conversation. It's been so informative for me, and I'm sure the audience shares that. We were supposed to be joined by Dr. Asma Yassin from Vienna, but unfortunately she was pulled aside for last-minute meeting for OPEC, and we were unable to. But I hope that sometime soon we will have her. And also, she promised to write a paper that we will publish as well within our series. So, and this question then falls on all the other panelists who are also experts on the oil sector. The question goes like that. Are Iraq's adherence to the OPEC plus production quotas and the Iraqi dinar's peg to the US dollar consistent with either the short-term or immediate-term reform solutions? Apart from aggressively raising government debt, how will the country be able to fund its short-term spending gaps? So 3 issues. One of them is the quotas that Iraq is being asked to meet from OPEC plus, and also the issue of the dinar dollar question, and how would that serve Iraq? And then finally, what are the solutions that government has to deal with, especially as I mentioned earlier that we talk about about $2 billion deficit a month. That puts the salaries in jeopardy. Every month, the government has to go through hurdles to pay salaries, and the government now is the main employer in the country. So it's a very interesting question, and I would like also to take opportunity of this question, because it touches on OPEC, is to have the panel fill us in on whatever they feel that was important to mention on the oil section in the paper as well. And I think we have about 10 minutes for that, divided among the panelists. So let's start with Ahmed. You need to unmute yourself, Ahmed.
Okay, again, unmute myself.
Sorry.
Okay, start again. So yeah, I think a lot of questions in a very short time. So I'll be quite brief if I can. Basically, I think on the OPEC plus quota, there are views in here in Iraq and among many people that is an unfair quota and stuff. And Minister Alawi certainly had argued a few months ago that he needs, OPEC needs to look at the formulas, not simply a question of a percentage, but also as adjusted for GDP per capita and so forth. However, the reality of the matter is that Iraq has very weak bargaining power with the OPEC, in that we can't keep on working with them to adjust that, and I think we always should do that. The question of the quota, I think the question is, we are the third largest exporter worldwide. And are we happy with the oil prices where we are in the 40s, or are we happy with oil prices in the 20s? Certainly, if you look at what happened with OPEC's move was OPEC plus or OPEC plus plus was unprecedented in terms of mopping up the supply. And did it work? Absolutely, it worked. Because if you look at the supply demand is more in balance in oil, that's one. The inventories that were overhanging, they definitely have been absorbed. So yes, our compliance worked in our favor in the sense that it lowered, it raised our prices. So that's one. And it's crucial for us we stay there, because I think if we break, the likelihood of oil prices breaking down is not going to be in our favor. We should work with them more on adjusting the percentages. But it's a question of realities are realities. I think in terms of the Iraqi dinar versus the dollar, I think that is something that will be thought about in long term. But whichever way we look at it, whichever way you analyze it, the forces that keeping the dollar, the Iraqi dinar where it is versus the dollar, are the amount of revenues we get. So we used to get about $6 to $6.5 billion, let's say. That's the demand for Iraqi dinars. Reverses to it a few $billion a month in terms of our imports. Our imports. So ultimately, when our income is 2.5, whether we look at it now or a few months later, and a devaluation seems to be incredibly likely. The question is how and when and under what circumstances. We have a window to work on, but in my mind, ultimately, it cannot be avoided. It's a question of numbers. They are there. Demand, supply, demand for Iraqi dinars come from oil sales. Oil sales are where they are. On the other hand, demand for exports will probably be lower, for imports will be lower, but that I think in terms of funding the deficit, there is very, very small room for funding the deficit in terms of borrowing. We cannot not borrow outside, given the structural deficit we have. So unless we seriously realign our budget, we're not going to be able to do that. We've almost exhausted domestic supply. However, if we do the right things, then the door opens up for the IMF to work with us and others worldwide, just like they happened in the past, and just like, for instance, done in Egypt in 2016 when they put their house in order. But we can't. We don't have a resource other than that. So I'll end my piece.
Harry?
I will just make one note regarding the OPEC Plus agreement. Unfortunately, the negotiation with the other members of OPEC and non-OPEC members wasn't, very in favor of Iraq economy, and that has to be reviewed as soon as possible, as we are seeing that the price of the oil is going further down unexpectedly. This is on the external part of the crisis. On the internal part, I think Iraq needs to find ways how to manage with the current income and also renegotiate with the IOCs of how they can drop the cost of the exploration and selling of oil. Those two things needs to be balanced by the Iraqi government in order to raise the fund, at least from now until probably mid next year, where we expect that the oil price will start to come up. But in all cases, we don't expect that is going to be more than $50 a barrel. So this is one of the issues that the current government needs to focus until the next election in June. how to balance between the quota, the OPEC plus quota, and how to deal with the IOCs internally in order to reduce the cost of exploration. In terms of the deficit, certainly this is a big issue that the government is facing right now. I think, in my opinion, there's no other alternative except to continue borrowing, issuing security bonds in order to cover at least the important parts of the budget, which is basically the salaries and so on. But this is not, of course, a solution. If we look to the, I think the white paper has mentioned this, the government borrowing has increased from 100 million in 2003 to more than 1 billion last year, and we expect that figure will be much more than that, and I think the last figure we heard is 42 billion. So I think, in my opinion, there's no immediate solution except the borrowing and and issuing security bonds on the short term, but on the long term, this is not going to be very helpful for Iraqi economy.
Thank you, Harry. Ali, your take?
Yeah, and very quickly, I think in the short term, obviously, and until the Iraqi government adopts and starts implement and shows strong determination in implementing fiscal reforms to bring the fiscal stance into a sustainable path, the risk premium and therefore the borrowing cost for the Iraqi government will remain high. But I think what we have seen across emerging markets, particularly in the post-COVID era, is that large deficits are now more or less a standard problem and challenge facing all emerging market economy. The question and the differentiation is about the path forward and the extent of commitment of authorities to reform that would allow them basically to resort to borrowing, but keep it in a sustainable way. Let us remind ourselves that, I mean, if we put Iraq in a regional context, even, I mean, Iraq's debt to GDP is around 70 to 75%, probably is going to be at the end of this year. This is by regional standards relatively okay. I mean, in Oman, we are talking about 80%, in Egypt and 90%. Obviously, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries are much lower. But also, Iraq has a much lower external debt to GDP at 40%. So you could argue that it has enough fiscal space. However, these debt indicators can deteriorate very quickly if, as I mentioned, the path is not a virtuous one. And I think in the short term, the new government or the existing government until the next election would need to show in its 2021 budget its commitment to reform, the political backup for it, the ability to implement it, and then work with the international financial markets and the international community, including the World Bank and other bilateral donors, and importantly the IMF, possibly through a staff monitoring program to really put and anchor the reform path that will help reduce Iraq's borrowing cost and reduce the impact on deteriorating its sovereign balance sheet.
Thank you, Alia. And we are exactly at 1 minute after 1 o'clock. So I am very grateful to all three of you for enlightening us on such complex issues that are important to know, understand, and also unpack. Iraq remains a very important country in the region, very important country for US and European policy makers. And it is a privilege to join you in this panel. Thank you very much, Alia. Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, Harry. It is awkward that Harry is in Washington and we are hosting him through Zoom. That testifies to the way where we are right now, but I look forward to seeing you sometime soon, Harry. And to our audience all over the globe, thank you. Have a wonderful weekend. Wishing you and your family safety and health. And once again, I'm very grateful to our communications team and to the Atlantic Council team for bringing us live here on a day again of that the Atlantic Council is closed. But this is a commitment that we all do as a team. What a panel. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Abbas, and thank you, Atlantic Council, and thank you for my wonderful co-panelists.
Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you.